The Laughing Officers of Luzon, April 12, 1942. Luzon, the Philippines. The jungle was alive with heat and noise, cicadas screeching like rivets driven into the air, and the thick, wet smell of rot and gunpowder mixing with diesel fumes. A line of captured American vehicles lay abandoned beside a dirt track. Trucks with shattered windshields, burnt-out tanks half sunk in the mud, and a strange little contraption no taller than a man's shoulder. Two Japanese officers approached it, their khaki uniforms crisp and spotless, despite the sweltering air. Major Hiroshi Nakazawa squinted at the small vehicle, his gloved hand resting on its olive-green hood. "Is this their truck?" he asked in disbelief. Beside him, Captain Sato let out a sharp laugh. "Truck? No, it looks like something a farmer's son might drive through rice fields." He circled the vehicle, a squat, boxy Willys Jeep, tapping its metal frame with the edge of his riding crop. America must be desperate if this is what they send to war. A group of soldiers joined in the laughter. To them it looked ridiculous, too small to carry men, too light to handle the jungle, and too crude to survive artillery fire. The officers mocked its simplicity. No armor, no weapon mounts, no enclosed cabin. But as Nakazawa leaned closer, he noticed something else. The machine's engine, though spattered with mud, looked intact. Its tires were caked in clay, yet still held firm. The odometer read over 1,000 miles. 1,000 miles through terrain where even Japanese Type 95 Hago tanks often bogged down. He frowned, uneasy. Before he could speak again, a young mechanic shouted from a few yards away, "Major, we tried starting it." The sound came, a rough, rattling cough, then a steady growl. The Jeep's tiny four-cylinder engine roared to life, its exhaust spitting like a defiant animal. The men froze. Sato's laughter faltered. "That little thing still runs." The mechanic grinned nervously. "Yes, sir," even after sitting in the rain. Nakazawa said nothing. The forest canopy shimmered with heat, and in that moment, the sound of the Jeep's running motor, simple, steady, unbothered, felt like a whisper of something much larger. The laughter had stopped. Far away, in factories across America, hundreds of these toys were being built every day. They would soon cross oceans, deserts, and battlefields, places no tank, truck, or horse could go, and the men who once laughed at them would soon see them again, in places they never thought possible. Section 2. The Machine That Wouldn't Stop. June 1942. The Allied camp was a hive of activity. Soldiers shouting over the whine of engines, mechanics sweating under the tropical sun, and the constant thud of crates being unloaded from Liberty ships. The war in the Pacific had shifted, and the Army was preparing to move north, toward New Guinea's jungles, where every mile of ground fought back with vines, mud and disease. Amid the chaos, a line of brand-new vehicles stood gleaming like green beetles. Each bore a small white star on its side, and a simple marking on the hood, Willys MB. Lieutenant James Jimmy Keller, a 25-year-old transport officer from Kansas, leaned against one of them and lit a cigarette. "Looks like toys, don't they?" said a Marine passing by. Keller smiled. "Maybe, but I'll bet my pay they'll still be running when your trucks are dead." He wasn't exaggerating. The Willys Jeep, with its 60-horsepower Go Devil engine, was proving unstoppable. It could climb a 30-degree slope, ford through 2 feet of water, and handle mud, sand or snow with the same stubborn determination. Its low weight meant it could be lifted out of ditches by 4 men or slung beneath aircraft for transport. Wherever soldiers went, the Jeep followed. It hauled ammunition, wounded men, generals, and mail. It became the dog-faced soldier's best friend, a faithful companion in a war that spared nothing else. In the steaming jungles of Papua, Keller's unit soon discovered what made it legendary. The rain came in sheets, turning trails into rivers of brown sludge. trucks sank up to their axles. Horses refused to move. Even the small Japanese Type 95 tanks struggled, their narrow tracks cutting into the muck like knives into butter. But the jeeps, those little laughable machines, kept crawling forward. Keller gritted his teeth as his jeep bucked and swayed through knee-deep mud, his hands gripping the wheel as if wrestling a live thing. Water splashed through the open cabin, soaking his boot. "Come on, baby," he muttered through clenched teeth. And it did. The engine groaned but never quit. The tires spun, caught, and surged forward again. Behind him, a train of soldiers trudged in the muck, using the jeep's tracks as a path. When they finally reached the next ridge, the men cheered. The little vehicle had done what their trucks couldn't. It had delivered food, ammo, and hope. In that moment, no one called it a toy anymore. Thousands of miles away, Japanese scouts reported sightings of small American cars appearing in impossible places, mountain trails, jungle clearings, even narrow riverbeds. Their commanders dismissed it as exaggeration. They would learn soon enough that the machine they mocked was not a toy. It was a symbol. Section 3. The Jungle Proving Ground. January 1943. Burma, New Guinea. The jungle was a nightmare of heat, rot, and blood. Every step sank into mud that smelled like death. Mosquitoes swarmed around open wounds, and the distant sound of machine gun fire echoed through the vines. The Japanese defensive lines near Burma were carved into the earth itself, bunkers woven from logs, trenches lined with bamboo, and camouflage so perfect that men could die without ever seeing who shot them. The Americans were exhausted. Supply lines were collapsing under the weight of terrain and weather. Trucks couldn't pass through the swamps. Horses and mules died from exhaustion, but the fighting didn't stop. And then came the Jeep. Lieutenant Keller's company had been ordered to ferry supplies from the beachhead to the front lines, a suicidal route of 12 miles through swampland. The engineers laughed when they first saw what Keller intended to use. "You'll never get those tin cans through there," one said, shaking his head. Keller just grinned. "Watch me." They stripped the jeeps of unnecessary weight, tore off windshields, removed seats, and waterproofed the engines with grease and canvas. Then, at dawn, they drove straight into the muck. The first mile was agony. The wheels churned and spun, engines screaming as water rose to the hoods. But the little vehicles didn't quit. Men walked alongside, shoving, guiding, pushing with all their strength. The jeeps crawled forward, hauling crates of ammunition, rations, and morphine through what looked like an endless graveyard of sunken trucks. By the time they reached the front, the soldiers waiting there could hardly believe their eyes. "You got through with that," one Marine said in disbelief, staring at the dripping, mud-streaked jeep. Keller laughed, wiping his face with a rag. "Hell yeah. She doesn't know how to stop." Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. Soon, every unit wanted Jeep. Mechanics worked day and night to keep them running, scavenging parts, improvising repairs with wire, tin, and even bamboo. Some Jeeps were converted into stretchers, some into gun platforms, and others into makeshift ambulances. Even Japanese troops began to notice. Scouts sent reports of American vehicles moving in places no tank could reach. In one intercepted message, a Japanese officer described them with disbelief. "The enemy possesses small cars that move like insects. They climb hills and cross rivers where our tanks sink. Their movement seems without limit." For the first time, fear crept into the tone. Because it wasn't just that the jeeps could go anywhere, it was that they did. They appeared suddenly, bringing reinforcements where none should exist, or evacuating wounded under fire, their small frames bouncing through shell craters as if defying the laws of war. In the jungle, soldiers began to say it as a joke, "God rides a Jeep." But in the mud, among the dead, it didn't sound like a joke at all. Section 4. The Axis Awakens to a Legend. April 1943. Rabaul, New Britain Island. At Japanese Army headquarters, The officers gathered in the dim light of a bamboo hut. Maps were pinned across the walls, streaked with grease and mud. Red lines, marked where Imperial forces had been forced to retreat in the jungles of Papua and the Solomons. Major Nakazawa, now stationed as a staff officer, leaned over the table, jaw tight. He remembered the little vehicle he'd once mocked on Luzon, that squat toy the Americans had left behind. Now, it was in every report crossing his desk. Enemy moves supplies through swamp trails using small vehicles. Infantry reinforcements arrive faster than expected. Ambush failed. Americans appeared from untracked forest road. Each note carried the same undertone: confusion, frustration, disbelief. The enemy was moving faster than terrain should allow. Even their tanks, aircraft and artillery seemed to arrive as if carried by invisible hands. Nakazawa finally looked up. "We underestimated them," he said quietly. "Their strength is not only in weapons, it is in movement." Colonel Tanaka scoffed. "Movement? With toys?" Nakazawa didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a faded photograph from his folder, captured by a Japanese war correspondent, near Buna. It showed an American Jeep half submerged in mud, its windshield down and 4 grinning soldiers aboard, one of them clutching a Browning .30 caliber machine gun. "They cross terrain our Type 95s cannot," Nakazawa continued. "They transport men faster than we can react. These vehicles, they are everywhere." The colonel studied the image in silence. To the Japanese high command, tanks were symbols of might, steel beasts, meant to crush through defenses. But the Pacific was no place for armor. The terrain mocked heavy machines. Swamps swallowed them. Bridges collapsed under their weight. Every island was a maze of jungle, coral, and mountain. Yet the Americans, with their absurd little jeep, moved as if the land obeyed them. The situation was no different in Europe. Reports from German officers on the Eastern Front mentioned the same phenomenon. American jeeps arriving with British or Soviet allies, darting across frozen fields, carrying officers, dispatches, or even more. The Wehrmacht soldiers gave it nicknames: Die kleine Bestie, the little beast. One German tanker reportedly said, "They're like fleas. You kill one, and 10 more appear." In Rabaul, Nakazawa placed the photo down and said, almost to himself, "Perhaps the Americans don't build perfection, but they build enough." Outside, the low drone of Allied bombers echoed across the bay. Soon the war's tide would shift, and everywhere it turned, from the desert to the jungle, to the frozen Ardennes, the same shape would appear: the flat hood, round headlights, and unshakable growl of the Willys Jeep. The toy had become a terror. Section 5. The Desert Workhorse. July 1943. North Africa. The wind screamed across the Libyan desert, lifting sand like a ghostly storm. The heat shimmered in waves that bent the horizon, turning distant dunes into mirages. To the untrained eye, it was a wasteland, a place where engines died, compasses lied, and men went mad. But cutting through that endless sea of dust came a column of jeeps, dozens of them, racing across the desert like predators. Their tires kicked up sand trails that stretched for miles, sunlight flashing off the barrels of mounted 30-caliber machine guns. These weren't ordinary transport vehicles anymore. The British Special Air Service, the SAS, had turned them into raiders. At the front of the column sat Major David Sterling, the founder of the unit. His face was wrapped in a sand scarf, his eyes narrowed behind goggles. He raised his hand, signaling a halt. The jeeps rolled to a stop in perfect unison, engines idling like patient beasts. Ahead, on the horizon, the faint outline of a German airfield shimmered. Dozens of Luftwaffe aircraft were lined up, unguarded, unsuspecting. Sterling spoke through the wind. "Remember, lads, hit hard, hit fast, and disappear. The desert is ours tonight." Engines roared. In a blur of motion, the jeeps surged forward, their mounted guns blazing. Tracer rounds cut through the darkness, tearing into fuel drums and aircraft. Explosions lit the night like flashes of lightning. Pilots and mechanics scrambled for cover. Too late. Within minutes, the airfield was a furnace. Then, as quickly as they came, the jeeps vanished back into the desert, their engines fading into the dunes. By dawn, they were gone. The German commander, who arrived later, couldn't believe it. They came from nowhere, he muttered, surveying the wreckage. No tanks, no trucks, only small cars. The jeep's legend had grown beyond the Pacific. It was now a universal soldier, as effective in the Sahara as it was in the jungle. Allied generals called it the mechanical mule, capable of doing the work of 10 men. Soldiers used it for everything: reconnaissance, rescue, sabotage, even weddings and funerals at the front. Back in the US, Willys overland engineers smiled at reports from the field. Their simple, boxy design, chosen for function over form, had survived freezing cold, blazing heat, and relentless rain. In the desert, British and American troops began painting names on their jeeps: Sand Flea, Hellfire, Lucky 7. They treated them like living companions, and for the men who drove them, the jeep became more than a vehicle. It was a lifeline, the difference between dying in the sand and finding the way home. Even German officers began to capture and reuse jeeps whenever possible. They stripped off Allied markings, added crosses, and drove them proudly. Some Wehrmacht units even requested their own versions. But as one German mechanic reportedly said, after driving a captured jeep, "You cannot copy the soul of this thing. It runs like it wants to win." And win it did. Across the deserts of Africa, the Willys Jeep had proven its worth, and its legend was only just beginning. Section 6. The Heartbeat of the Front Lines. June 1944, Normandy, France. The world had exploded into thunder. From the beaches to the hedgerows, the ground trembled with the sound of artillery and the roar of engines. Smoke rolled through the air like storm clouds, thick and black. The invasion of Europe had begun. Among the chaos, weaving through shell craters, burning tanks, and wounded men, came the unmistakable growl of the Willys Jeep. Sergeant Tom Harlow gripped the wheel with white-knuckled hands as he steered his jeep up a muddy incline. The windscreen was gone, shattered by shrapnel an hour earlier. His co-driver, Private Wilson, crouched beside him, clutching a Thompson submachine gun and yelling over the roar of distant fire. "Bridge ahead's gone," Wilson shouted. "Then we'll make our own road." Harlow barked, gunning the engine. The jeep bounced and lurched through the churned earth, mud spraying in arcs. The men in the back, a medic, and 2 wounded soldiers, held on for their lives. Bullets snapped through the hedgerow, one tearing through the jeep's canvas seat. The little vehicle kept moving. When they finally reached the makeshift aid station, Harlow slammed the brakes and yelled, "Get these men inside." The medic jumped out, pulling stretchers free. The jeep, coated in mud and blood, idled as if waiting for orders. A captain passed by, glancing at the battered machine. "That thing's been through hell," he muttered. Harlow spat a mouthful of dirt. "And it'll drive back through it, sir." He wasn't wrong. All across Normandy, jeeps became the arteries of the Allied invasion. They carried ammunition to the front, wounded back to the rear, and officers between units. They pulled anti-tank guns, towed trailers, and even served as mobile command posts. In some cases, engineers used them to lay telephone wire or tow gliders into position. The jeep became the rhythm of war itself, its growl echoing through the hedgerows at dawn, through bombed villages at dusk. Wherever it went, soldiers followed. German forces, accustomed to the slow grind of their panzer divisions, were bewildered. The Allies moved with a speed they couldn't comprehend, a living network of mobility and communication that seemed unstoppable. One Wehrmacht prisoner, after seeing a convoy of jeeps race through the mud, simply said, "They move like water. We cannot stop water." As the Allies pushed deeper into France, the jeep was everywhere,
crossing rivers on pontoons, rolling through Paris streets beneath confetti and cheers, and speeding toward the Rhine under tracer-lit skies. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't armored, but it was everywhere, and in the eyes of those who rode it, the Jeep was more than a machine. It was a companion that shared every battle, every loss, every victory. A silent soldier, with 4 wheels and a beating heart, made of steel.
Section 7. The winter that tested all machines. December 1944. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. Snow fell like ash from a dying sky. The pines were heavy with frost, and the air burned the lungs with every breath. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the world was white, cold, silent, and deadly. Engines struggled to turn over. Fuel froze in canisters. Tracks of Sherman tanks cracked in the cold. Men huddled in foxholes, clutching rifles that jammed in the freezing wind. The Ardennes was eating the war alive. And still, through the snow and smoke, the sound came. A low, persistent growl. The Jeep, Sergeant Harlow's old vehicle, patched and painted a dozen times since Normandy, now crawled through knee-deep snow, its tires wrapped with chains for traction. The headlights were dimmed under blackout covers, the hood smeared with mud and soot to blend with the forest. Inside, Lieutenant Keller, the same man who'd once driven through New Guinea's jungles, sat with a map in his lap. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from cold. "Can this thing even make it?" one of the men in the back muttered. Keller smiled through chattering teeth. "She's made it through hell twice already. Ardennes won't stop her." He wasn't bluffing. The Willys MB wasn't built for comfort, but it was built to survive. Its simple mechanics, no fancy parts, no delicate systems, made it the only vehicle that could be fixed with a wrench and a curse. In the freezing dark, when engines of larger trucks refused to start, the Jeep's Go Devil engine still turned over, coughing, spitting, alive. Allied lines were collapsing under the German counterattack. The 21st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, low on food, fuel, and ammunition. Only small convoys could slip through the blizzard, and every one of them relied on Jeeps. Through snow-choked roads and shell-blasted paths, they carried stretchers, medical kits, radio parts, and sometimes just coffee. To the men who hadn't slept in days, drivers used scarves to cover their faces from frostbite, their eyes burning from the cold. A frozen soldier once wrote in his diary, "When everything else stopped, the tanks, the trucks, the planes, the Jeeps still came. You could hear them before you saw them. That sound meant we weren't alone." By Christmas Day, many Jeeps bore bullet holes patched with tin and cloth. Some ran on tires filled with straw, others on half-empty tanks of frozen fuel, but they ran, always. In captured German reports, officers described the American mobility as inhuman. One frustrated panzer commander wrote, "The enemy's light vehicles move as if untouched by snow or mud. They arrive where no man or machine should pass." The irony was bitter. The same vehicle Japanese officers had once called a toy was now defying winter itself, rolling through Europe's frozen forests, delivering warmth, courage, and light. As the snow thickened and the night deepened, Keller's Jeep rolled on. Its engine echoed softly through the white silence, the heartbeat of an army that refused to freeze. Section 8. The machine that conquered the world. May 1945, Berlin, Germany. The war was ending. Smoke drifted from the ruins of what had once been the heart of the Reich. Streets that had echoed with the iron march of boots now lay silent, filled instead with rubble and the low rumble of Allied engines. Through the shattered avenues rolled a convoy of Jeeps, mud spattered, dented, their paint scarred by shrapnel, but still running. American, British, and Soviet officers rode side by side, their flags fluttering in the breeze. For the soldiers watching from the sidewalks, the sight was surreal. The same vehicle that had crawled through Pacific jungles and North African dunes now rolled triumphantly through Berlin's ruins. Sergeant Harlow leaned out from his Jeep,
eyes wide as he passed the burned-out hulks of German tanks. A destroyed Tiger lay on its side like a dead giant. Its 88mm gun snapped. Its armor blackened. Beside it, his Jeep idled quietly, its small engine humming with casual indifference. "Funny," Harlow muttered. "All that armor, all that power, and this little thing beat it." Private Wilson, now a seasoned veteran, laughed wearily. "Guess numbers count more than steel." They weren't wrong. The Allies had produced nearly 150,000 Jeeps, more than the total number of tanks built by Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Each one was a soldier's friend, a commander's tool, and a nation's secret weapon of mobility. In the Pacific, Jeeps had carried generals through jungles. In Europe, they had crossed minefields and rivers. In the deserts, they had raided behind enemy lines. From Normandy to Okinawa, they were everywhere, the unassuming backbone of the modern army. Even enemy soldiers, once dismissive, had learned respect. In captured correspondence, one Japanese officer wrote near the end of the war, "We once laughed at their small cars, now they swarm across every land. The sound of their engines is the sound of our defeat." When the fighting finally ceased, Jeeps rolled into liberated cities, carrying bread instead of bullets, children instead of soldiers. Crowds cheered as the same vehicles that had roared into battle now carried hope. Photographs from May 1945 show Jeeps in Paris, Rome, Warsaw, and Tokyo, their drivers smiling, flags draped across their hood. In every picture the message was the same. This was not the weapon of conquest, but the tool of endurance. Simple, reliable, and relentless, the Jeep had not just crossed terrain, it had crossed history. Years later, a war correspondent who'd followed the front from Africa to Germany, "If one machine could tell the story of World War II, it would not be the tank, the plane, or the ship. It would be the Jeep. It carried us through hell, and somehow always brought us home." And somewhere in the smoldering ruins of Berlin, as dusk settled over the silent city, a single Jeep rattled down the cobblestone street, headlights glowing like twin stars in the dust. Its engine purred, steady and defiant, as if reminding the world, "You can mock what you don't understand, but you cannot stop what refuses to quit."
Section 9. The Legacy That Never Died. August 1945. Manila, the Philippines. The war in the Pacific was over. Japan had surrendered. The once occupied streets of Manila echoed, not with gunfire but with laughter, chatter, and the hum of engines. Those same unbreakable engines that had carried victory across half the world. In the tropical dusk, American Jeeps rolled past cheering civilians, their sides dented, their tires bald, their paint faded by sun and salt, yet they still moved with that unmistakable rhythm, that confident growl that seemed eternal. Major Hiroshi Nakazawa stood in silence, on a street corner, his uniform stripped of rank insignia. A prisoner now, he watched as a convoy of Jeeps passed, the very machines he had once laughed at, 3 years before, on the muddy trails of Luzon. He remembered the mocking words, the laughter, the disbelief, and now, seeing them again, in the same city, victorious and unstoppable, he felt a strange, bitter admiration. A young American officer, noticing his stare, smiled lightly. "Hell of a thing, isn't it?" he said, patting the hood of his Jeep. Nakazawa nodded slowly. "It never breaks," the officer chuckled. "Sometimes it breaks, but it always finds a way to keep going." That was the truth, the essence of the Jeep. It wasn't indestructible, it wasn't perfect, but it endured. Its design was so honest, so simple, that it became more than a military tool. It became a symbol of resilience. After the war, Jeeps spread across the globe. They plowed fields in France, carried doctors through remote African villages, delivered mail in Italy, and helped rebuild shattered towns in the Philippines. Former soldiers bought them as the first civilian cars they ever owned.
a piece of their wartime soul, parked in their driveway. The Willys MB evolved into the civilian CJ series, civilian Jeep, carrying forward the same DNA that had once crossed the Rhine and the jungles of Burma. Farmers, explorers, and adventurers drove it across deserts, mountains, and frozen tundras. In time, nations began building their own versions: Land Rovers, Toyotas, and countless off-road descendants, all born from the same simple idea, a machine that could go anywhere and do anything. And yet, even decades later, veterans could still recognize the sound of that little four-cylinder, Go Devil engine. It wasn't just the sound of war, it was the sound of courage, ingenuity, and survival. In museums, rusted Jeeps stand behind glass, their seats torn, their paint faded. Tourists pass by quickly, their eyes drawn instead to tanks and aircraft, but the veterans who stop in front of them know better. They know that those small, battered machines carried the weight of an entire generation, across mud, fire, snow, and history itself. Nakazawa, years later, would write in his memoirs from Tokyo, "We mocked the Jeep as a toy, but that toy conquered empires. It was not a machine of destruction. It was a machine of persistence. It was America itself, imperfect, loud, relentless, and free." And in that truth lies the heart of the story. Not the biggest weapon, not the strongest armor, just the will to keep moving, 1 mile farther, 1 road deeper, 1 battle longer. That was the Jeep's secret, and it never stopped. Section 10. The Spirit of Motion. June 6, 1954. Normandy, France. 10 years to the day since D-Day. The beaches were quiet now, the waves washing over the same sand that had once been stained with blood and fire. Small white crosses stretched toward the horizon, the sea wind whispering through the grass. An old Jeep rolled down the narrow coastal road, its olive-green paint faded, its tires crackling softly against the gravel. Behind the wheel sat Sergeant Tom Harlow, older now, his hair gray at the edges, his uniform replaced with a worn leather jacket. In the passenger seat, his grandson held a small American flag, eyes wide with curiosity. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "did you really drive this in the war?" Harlow smiled faintly. "Yeah, kid, she carried me through more places than I can count." He parked near a bluff overlooking Omaha Beach, the same beach where he'd once driven this Jeep through chaos and gunfire. Now, only the wind and gulls remained. He shut off the engine. The silence that followed felt sacred. He ran his hand over the dashboard, tracing the dents and scratches like the lines on a map. Each one told a story. A bullet that missed by inches, a tree that didn't, 100 miles of mud and frost and hope. "This old thing," he said softly, "she never gave up, no matter how bad it got." The boy tilted his head. "Why?" Harlow looked out toward the sea, eyes reflecting the gray sky. "Because giving up wasn't in her design, and it wasn't in ours either." He started the engine again. The Jeep coughed once, twice, then settled into that familiar growl, steady and strong, just as it had a decade ago. As they drove back toward the village, other veterans saluted, smiling at the sight. Some waved canes, others simply nodded. Every man there knew what that sound meant. It wasn't just metal and oil, it was memory. By the end of the war, the Jeep had crossed continents, liberated nations, and carved itself into the human story. It was a machine that outlived the war it fought, a machine that became a symbol of freedom's endurance. It taught a lesson not written in any manual or doctrine, that victory doesn't always come from might, but from motion, from refusing to stop when the world demands you should. The Willys Jeep never asked for glory. It never sought praise or parade, but wherever it went, from the mud of Burma to the rubble of Berlin, men followed it, trusted it, and survived because of it. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't graceful, but it was honest, and it was unbreakable. As the last light of day fell over Normandy, Harlow's Jeep rolled slowly past the graves of the fallen. Its small engine hummed against the wind, a heartbeat echoing through time. And if one listened closely, it was as though history itself was whispering through that steady hum.